You know, usually when we think about history, we picture these, I don't know, these grand, highly visible moments,
Yeah.
like a concrete wall coming down in Berlin or a treaty being signed on some giant mahogany
Right,
desk.
the big cinematic stuff.
Exactly. But if you take a look at the tag on your shirt right now and seriously check where it was made, you're actually looking at the artifact of a quiet, almost invisible revolution.
Yeah.
A profound macroeconomic shift that completely rewired the globe over the last few decades.
And we literally wear the results of those shifts every single day. I mean, we interact with them when we buy a phone or, put gas in our cars, often without even realizing the immense, deliberate structural forces that design this entire global supply chain.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today our mission is to unpack a stack of historical and economic research to understand how the modern globalized economy, specifically the era of neoliberalism, radically reshaped the world outside the West, basically from the late 1970s up through the 2000s.
And to set the scope for you, we need to draw some firm boundaries here. A lot of economic history focuses heavily on the wealthy global north, the US, Western Europe, Japan.
The usual suspects.
Right. But today's focus is strictly on three crucial interconnected areas that actually do the heavy lifting in this system. That is the global south, China, and the former Soviet bloc.
Okay, let's unpack this. If we want to understand the globalized economy, we first need to look at how the quote-unquote factory floor of the world was built. And a key takeaway from the research is that a lot of these countries, well, they didn't exactly volunteer for the job.
No, they absolutely did not. In the global south, and we're talking about Latin America, Africa, parts of Asia integration into this new global market was often forcefully imposed through what economists call the Washington Consensus.
Right. I've heard that term thrown around a lot in political debates, but what was the actual mechanism? Was it a treaty they signed or?
It was more like an economic ultimatum, honestly.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The Washington Consensus was a strict set of policy demands pushed by institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. The core pillars were aggressive deregulation, throwing open local markets to foreign capital, and the rapid privatization of public assets.
So if a country needed money, they had to play ball.
Exactly. If a developing nation wanted a loan to, say, build infrastructure or stabilize its currency, they had to agree to these terms. They basically had to sell off state-owned water, power grids, mineral rights, and usually to foreign corporations. Yeah.
And I imagine a lot of newly independent or developing nations weren't exactly thrilled about handing their economies right back over to foreign corporations.
Oh, resistance was fierce. But when countries pushed back, the consequences were severe. This is where we see the geopolitical muscle of the global north really step in.
Like, how severe are we talking?
We're talking about severe economic coercion, and in several cases, actively backing military coups to violently enforce these free market policies. A prime example from the research is Operation Condor in the 70s and 80s.
Right. I know Operation Condor involved military dictatorships in South America, but how does that tie into global economics?
What's fascinating here is the underlying motive. Operation Condor was a campaign of political repression and state terror involving right-wing dictatorships in Chile, Argentina, Brazil, heavily backed by the United States. And while it was framed as an anti-communist crusade, a massive part of the actual on-the-ground mechanism was crushing organized labor. They violently suppressed labor unions, indigenous land rights groups, and basically anyone resisting the privatization of their national resources.
So they clear out any opposition.
Exactly. By eliminating that resistance, they created a perfectly compliant, deregulated environment for foreign capital to just flow right in.
So you violently clear the board, and then what happens? Like, how does the global supply chain actually shift?
Then begins the era of industrial relocation. Multinational companies in the global north realized they could pack up their blue-collar manufacturing jobs and move them south.
Hunting for cheaper labor.
Right, cheap labor and weak environmental regulations. They started with the Asian tigers, places like South Korea and Taiwan, and eventually moved into Latin America and Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, they kept the highly lucrative white-collar management, design, and finance jobs back up north.
Which creates this massive divergence in wealth. And the data actually maps this out in something called the elephant curve, right? I think it was introduced by the economist Branko Milanovic.
Yes, the elephant curve. Let's try to visualize the data for a second. Imagine a graph tracking income growth from the late 80s to the 2000s. You have this massive bulge in the middle, representing a rising global middle class.
And these are mostly factory workers in those newly industrialized economies, right? People who saw their baseline incomes go up.
Exactly.
Okay, so that big bulge in the middle is the back of the elephant.
Right. Then, on the far right of the graph, the top 1% of the global elite, multinational CEOs, financiers, they saw their wealth absolutely skyrocket into the stratosphere.
So that's the trunk of the elephant reaching straight up.
You got it. But between the back and the trunk, there's a deep plunge in the graph. That dip represents the lower middle and working class in the global north. Factory workers in places like the American Midwest or Northern England.
Because their jobs went overseas.
Exactly. Their income completely stagnated or even fell. They're the dip at the base of the trunk.
Yeah.
And as multinational corporations grew, they engaged in what's called a secession of the rich.
A secession, like pulling away from society.
Yeah, they began moving their profits into offshore tax havens, leveraging their immense wealth against national governments to avoid paying taxes anywhere, not in the north where they were headquartered and not in the south where their products were actually made.
Man, to really visualize the scale of this imbalance between the North and the South, there's this incredible thought experiment in the sources with graph paper. Let's call it the notebook squares exercise.
Oh, this is a great visual.
Yeah, so if you picture a standard piece of graph paper, let's say one single square represents $130 billion.
Right, and that single square, that 130 billion, that represents the total foreign aid given by the global north to the south every single year.
Okay, so one square of charity.
Now draw 20 squares. That's roughly $2 trillion. That represents the money flowing from the north to the south in foreign direct investments. You know, building factories, buying up privatized companies.
All right, so one square of aid, 20 squares of investment. I mean, on paper, it sounds like the global north is just pouring money into the developing world.
It looks that way, yeah, until you measure the wealth flowing in the opposite direction. To represent the wealth extracted from the south back to the north every single year, you have to draw 50 squares.
Oh my God.
That is about $5 trillion.
Wait, hold on. 50 squares. $5 trillion every single year. I mean, how is that even possible? How can that much wealth legally leave these countries without someone putting a stop to it?
Because it happens through mechanisms that are entirely legal within the system the North designed. First, you have massive interest payments on the sovereign debt those countries were forced to take on.
Right.
Second, unfair international trade rules that heavily tariff finished goods from the South but demand zero tariffs on raw materials. But the biggest mechanism is something called transfer pricing.
Okay, break that down for me. What is transfer pricing?
Say a multinational company has a subsidiary in the global South that mines copper. That subsidiary sells the copper at a deliberately massive loss to a shell company owned by the same multinational in a zero tax haven.
Wait, so they sell it to themselves at a loss?
Exactly. The subsidiary in the South declares bankruptcy or zero profit, meaning it pays zero taxes to the local government that provided the labor and the land.
Wow.
Then, the shell company sells the copper on the global market at full price, pocketing all the profit tax-free. That is how you extract $5 trillion a year. The underlying legal and institutional system is just heavily biased.
There's actually a really striking anecdote about a cartoon that captures this institutional bias perfectly. It shows researchers from the global north easily hopping on planes, flying down to the global south to extract data, study local populations, and basically boost their careers.
Yeah, it's a completely open border for them.
Right. But meanwhile, a researcher from the global south trying to attend an academic conference in London or New York faces this mountain of insurmountable visa hurdles, background checks, and prohibitive costs. The border is a swinging door if you're from the north and a brick wall if you're from the south.
And this systemic extraction brings up a major debate about poverty. Because defenders of this neoliberal globalized system frequently point to a massive, unprecedented reduction in global poverty over the last 40 years.
I hear that stat all the time.
Right, but to make that claim, they use a very specific metric, the World Bank's poverty threshold, which for a long time was set at just $1.90 a day. By that metric, millions of people were, quote-unquote, lifted out of poverty.
I mean, I am looking at these economic realities, and I just don't buy that definition of poverty. Think about it. If I come into your rural community, bulldoze your ancestral farm, and close the common lands where you used to forage and hunt.
Right, taking away your non-monetary wealth.
Exactly. And then I pay you $2 a day to sew shirts in an unventilated sweatshop. The spreadsheet says you've crossed the poverty line. You now have monetary income. But are you richer? You've lost your home, your community support system, your food security, and your autonomy.
It's a sleight of hand with data, really. Many economists argue that a realistic threshold for a decent standard of living, having access to basic nutrition, life expectancy, shelter, is actually around $7.40 a day.
And what happens to the data when you use that number?
When you adjust the metric to 740, the grand narrative of global poverty reduction completely stalls out. It hasn't decreased nearly as much as claimed, except in one specific place.
Right. If you look closely at the data, almost all of the significant poverty reduction that actually did happen globally occurred in China, which is the biggest irony of this whole era.
Absolutely.
Because we just talked about how the Washington Consensus systematically drained wealth from the global south, but China played the globalization game and won. And they did it specifically by refusing to follow those rules.
Exactly. Neoliberal economists frequently try to claim China's rise as a victory for free market capitalism. But doing so requires completely ignoring the massive, calculating state intervention involved. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping took over and initiated a policy of reform and opening up, officially termed socialism with Chinese characteristics.
So they introduced capitalism but kept the communist state apparatus.
Yeah. They restored capitalist mechanisms like private property, market pricing, profit motives to stimulate growth, but they maintained an incredibly strict, centralized grip on the macroeconomic levers. They controlled the banking sector, the currency exchange rates, and heavily restricted foreign ownership.
This strategy of state-led capitalism isn't entirely unique, though, right? Like, how does this compare to what Spain tried to do in the 1960s?
That's a vital comparison from the research. Under the dictator Francisco Franco, Spain enacted a policy called desarrollismo, or developmentalism. Spain essentially told foreign companies, come build your factories here. We have a cheap, severely repressed labor force that isn't allowed to strike. And it worked. Briefly, foreign capital flowed in. But Spain hit a ceiling.
Why? What was the ceiling?
They were just a cheap assembly line for foreign companies who kept all the technological know-how. Spain didn't have the leverage to demand anything more.
So why didn't China hit that same ceiling? Why aren't they just assembling cheap plastic toys forever?
Sheer scale. Multinationals weren't just looking at China's cheap labor. They were salivating over a virtually untapped market of over 1 billion new consumers.
Ah, I get it. So China is basically the bouncer at the most exclusive, incredibly popular nightclub in the world.
That's a great way to put it.
Multinationals are lined up down the block, desperate to get inside. And the Chinese government, acting as the bouncer, says, you want to come in and sell to our VIPs? Fine. But the cover charge is handing over the blueprints to your technology.
That is exactly the mechanism. It's called forced technology transfer. Through state-mandated joint ventures, if an American car company wanted to build a factory in China, they legally had to partner with a Chinese firm and share their engineering secrets.
Wow.
And over a couple of decades, China absorbed that knowledge, allowing them to rapidly transition from manufacturing low-value garments to producing their own high-tech electronics, solar panels, and electric vehicles.
Though we also have to acknowledge the foundation they were building on, right? You can't just mandate high-tech manufacturing if your population can't read the blueprints.
Precisely. Despite the deep flaws and tragedies of the Maoist era prior to '78, that period left China with a highly modernized, disciplined workforce. Under Mao, life expectancy and adult literacy actually doubled.
Really?
Yeah. When Deng Xiaoping opened the economy, he wasn't starting from scratch. He had a healthy, literate, organized population ready to be mobilized.
But the whole system is a massive balancing act of contradictions. You have explosive privatization, but without the Western quote-unquote rule of law that protects private property from state seizure. You have skyrocketing wealth inequality. I mean, Deng famously said, to get rich is glorious, but it's maintained by a strict authoritarian social order.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it sets up a truly staggering contrast. China proved that if you keep an iron grip on the state while slowly, carefully opening the economic valve, you can control the outcome. But what if you just take a sledgehammer and smash the valve entirely?
Which is exactly what happened in the Soviet Union. We moved from China's highly calculated, gradual rise to the absolute terrifying chaos of the USSR's collapse.
To understand the trauma of this, remember the Cold War context. For decades, the globe was defined by a bipolar world, the capitalist NATO bloc versus the communist Warsaw Pact. But by the 80s, the Soviet economy was deeply stagnating.
Yeah.
So Mikhail Gorbachev stepped in with two major reforms: perestroika, which was an economic restructuring trying to introduce some market elements, and glasnost, a policy of political openness and civil rights.
But unlike China, which kept the political lid clamped shut while opening the economy, Gorbachev opened both at the same time, and the whole thing unraveled with astonishing speed.
Overnight, basically.
Yeah. The Berlin Wall falls in '89. By '91, the USSR is completely dissolved, and a lot of Western analysts at the time took a massive victory lap. Francis Fukuyama published his famous end of history thesis, basically arguing that Western liberal democracy and deregulated capitalism were the final, permanent evolutionary states of human governance.
And that hubris drove what happened next in Russia under President Boris Yeltsin in the 90s. Advised by Western economists, Russia implemented what was called shock therapy. This was a violent, overnight transition from a completely state-run economy to radical deregulated capitalism.
Walk me through the mechanics of that, because how do you even privatize an entire nation overnight?
One of the main mechanisms was the voucher system. The government issued vouchers to every citizen, representing a tiny share of the state's assets, factories, oil rigs, mines. The theory was that everyone would become a little shareholder in the new capitalist Russia.
But the reality on the ground was completely different. I mean, imagine you're a listener waking up in Moscow in 1992. Last week, the state guaranteed your housing, your pension, and your food. Today, price controls are gone, hyperinflation hits, and your life savings can't even buy a loaf of bread. You're starving.
Right.
So what do you do with that piece of paper, that voucher? You sell it for food.
Exactly. And a handful of ruthless, well-connected insiders, former Soviet bureaucrats or black market operators, had the cash to buy up millions of those vouchers from desperate citizens for pennies on the dollar.
It's just a massive transfer of wealth.
Almost overnight, a small group of men acquired control over the world's largest reserves of oil, gas, and minerals. This birthed the enormously wealthy Russian oligarchs, while millions of ordinary citizens experienced a catastrophic drop in life expectancy, widespread alcoholism, and deep poverty.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. How does human psychology process that kind of whiplash? You go from being a feared global superpower to enduring widespread economic humiliation and chaos in less than a decade.
It creates a profound, visceral sense of betrayal, and that trauma paves the way for a fierce authoritarian backlash. Sociologists describe this political shift using a semicircle metaphor.
Okay, a semicircle.
Imagine the political spectrum as an arch. The Russian public felt that the left-road Soviet communism had completely failed them in the 80s.
Right, so they travel up to the top of the arch, the center road, Western liberal democracy, and free market capitalism under Yeltsin. But that road just led to hyperinflation, corruption, and national humiliation.
So, feeling economically terrified and betrayed by the center, they don't go back left. They instinctively slide down the other side of the arch, down the right road, toward reactionary authoritarianism.
Interesting.
People who are scared and humiliated crave order above all else. This is the exact psychological environment that allowed Vladimir Putin to rise to power. He promised to crush the chaos of the 90s. He neutralized Yeltsin's unruly oligarchs, replacing them with a state-controlled oligarchy strictly loyal to him, and he promised to return to national pride and stability.
And a major tool for rebuilding that national pride is weaponized nostalgia. There's a brilliant concept in the research for this called the sissy effect. It describes how ordinary people will identify with the imagined glory of an aristocratic past rather than their actual historical reality.
Right, the fantasy version of history.
It's essentially an Instagram filter for history. It edits out all the starving peasants, the serfdom, the disease, and leaves only the gilded palaces, the military parades, and the princesses.
The cultural shift is staggering if you look at the media. Take a comparison of national anthems from the source text. If you watch a broadcast of the 1982 Soviet anthem, the visual focus is entirely on industry. Steel workers pouring metal, massive combines harvesting wheat, and ideals of proletarian equality.
Right. But if you watch the modern Russian anthem video under Putin,
The workers are completely gone. The visual focus is on gilded Orthodox icons, double-headed eagles, white aristocratic princesses, and a deep romantic nostalgia for the Tsarist Empire. Its complete visual rewrite of the national identity.
Putin forged a massive alliance with the Russian Orthodox Church to project this image of a sacred, unified, morally pure nation standing strong against a West they frame as decadent and chaotic.
This raises an important question about the geopolitical fallout of this era. Ultimately, the former Soviet zone split into two distinct opposing camps. On one side, you have the stabilized liberal democracies, places like Poland and the Baltic states, that managed a smoother transition and integrated into European Union and NATO.
Right.
On the other side, you have reactionary authoritarian governments, Russia, Belarus, and their allies, who utterly rejected Western liberalism and are now actively looking toward China's multipolar model of state-led capitalism.
It's an incredible chain of events, a completely rewired globe driven by policies that most have never even voted on.
If we synthesize the three pillars we've discussed today, the architecture of the modern economy becomes clear. First, the global South was forcefully integrated into a system designed to extract its wealth through debt and transfer pricing to subsidize the global North.
Right.
Second, China recognized the trap, manipulated the system using its sheer scale and state control, and forced technology transfers to become a rival economic superpower. And third, the Soviet Union's chaotic, unmanaged plunge into that exact same system led to devastating oligarchy, which inevitably birthed the reactionary authoritarian backlash we see today.
So what does this all mean? We started this deep dive by asking you to look at the tag on your shirt. If the current model of global wealth relies as heavily as this research suggests on the global South, subsidizing the North with cheap labor and extracted resources, and if the biggest economic success story of the last 40 years, China succeeded precisely by refusing to follow the North's rules.
Yeah.
What happens to the global economy when the factory nations finally decide they have enough leverage to stop playing the game? Take one more look at that shirt tag. Think about the incredible invisible journey it took to get to your closet. And ask yourself, how much longer can a system built on this kind of imbalance actually hold?